Please, I beg you, take my life but spare my sister. Let her go free, I will pay the price.
Genevieve Thorne had known this silence was coming for 48 hours. She had been calculating her options since the moment the constable's hand closed around her sister's arm outside the village inn, and she had arrived in this courtroom having exhausted every alternative and arrived at the only one remaining. She stood in the prisoner's box with her hands at her sides and her spine straight and her eyes on the magistrate's bench, and she was counting the width of the floor between the wooden rail and the bailiff's position, the weight of the brass inkwell on the clerk's table, the distance to the side door. These were not desperate calculations. They were the calculations of a woman who understood that the moment she stopped measuring the room was the moment the room won. Her sister Ilara stood beside her. Ilara was 16 years old and shaking so hard that Genevieve could feel it through the thin wool of their touching sleeves. She was shaking because she was cold, and she was cold because the dress she wore was entirely inadequate for a Yorkshire December and entirely typical of the life they had led, the life of a baker's daughters in a county where a lord's silver was worth more than a girl's future. Ilara had not stolen the pocket watch. This was the fact that mattered and the fact that did not matter at all, which was the essential nature of justice as practiced in the northern counties when the accusation came from Lord Victor Stirling and the accused came from nowhere. Lord Stirling had placed the watch in Ilara's basket himself. He had done it the moment she refused to follow him into the stables behind the village inn, refused with the particular terror of a girl who understood exactly what following him into the stables would mean. He had placed the watch there with a smile and the smooth practiced ease of a man who had done this before, who had used the machinery of the law as a trap baited with silver, who understood that a girl from nowhere had no mechanism to defend herself against a man with a fur-lined coat and a standing account at the magistrate's preferred tavern. The courtroom smelled of wet iron and human defeat. The wooden floorboards had rotted soft in the corners. The fire in the hearth had been allowed to burn low enough that the cold was a physical presence, pressing down on the prisoner's box with the particular cruelty of a system that had stopped bothering to pretend it cared about the people moving through it. Magistrate Malker sat behind the elevated bench with the absolute boredom of a man who had been destroying lives before his morning tea for 20 years and had long since stopped finding it interesting. He was a small man made large by elevation and the particular architecture of authority, the raised bench, the official robe, the gavel that gave ordinary violence the sound of inevitability. He looked at Ilara the way he looked at all of them. Not with cruelty. With absence. As though she were a line item in a ledger rather than a person standing on the rotted floorboards of his room. The sentence is 10 years, Malker said. The Northern Penal Colony. The carriage departs at noon. The sound Ilara made was very small. It was the sound of a person whose entire structural understanding of the world has just given way beneath them. Not a scream, not a sob, but the small broken exhalation of someone whose legs have stopped working. She collapsed against Genevieve's shoulder, her knees gone entirely, her weight suddenly all against her sister's side. Genevieve took it. She absorbed her sister's weight without moving, without swaying, without looking away from the magistrate's face. She held Ilara up with her right arm and kept her left hand flat on the wooden rail of the prisoner's box, and she looked at Malker and she thought, not this. Not this. Not while I am still standing in this room with blood in my body and air in my lungs and everything I have left. She looked at Lord Stirling. He sat in the gallery wearing his heavy fur-lined coat and the smile of a man who had set a trap and watched it close and was now enjoying the specific private pleasure of someone whose cruelty has been officially ratified. His dark eyes were on Ilara's collapsed figure with an interest that made Genevieve's stomach turn over completely. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. She memorized his face in the way you memorize a thing you intend to understand completely before you are finished with it. Then she stepped forward and pressed her hands flat against the wooden rail of the prisoner's box and said the thing she had been calculating for 48 hours. Take my life, she said. Her voice was entirely level. It did not shake. It did not rise. It came out of her with the clear, carrying quality of a bell struck in a cold room, clean and absolute and impossible to misinterpret. Spare my sister. The courtroom went very still. Malker looked at her with mild amusement, the way a man looks at a performing animal that has done something unexpectedly interesting. The law does not accept trades, he said. I will sign the labor contract for the Sterling estate, Genevieve said. 20 years. No wages. Full indenture under the terms of the County Labor Code, Section 14. Let Alara go free and I will bind myself to his house before you leave this bench. The room was completely silent. She felt Alara's hand close around her arm from behind, the grip of a girl trying to pull her back from an edge, trying to tell her no, trying to stop her with the only mechanism she had left, which was her hands and her need. Genevieve did not look back. She kept her eyes on Malker's face. The magistrate looked at Lord Sterling. The look of a man checking whether the offer was acceptable to the party with the actual power in the room. Lord Sterling sat forward in his chair. He looked at Genevieve with a different quality of attention now, something that had moved from satisfaction to interest in the way a man's expression moves when an object he thought was useful reveals itself to be valuable. His smile widened into something that had nothing pleasant in it whatsoever. That is an unconventional offer, Malker said. But the court might find it an acceptable restitution. If his lordship agrees. Sterling stood up. He was going to agree. The words were forming in his mouth. The specific shape of his triumph was visible in his face, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he was already looking at Genevieve as though the transaction had been completed. The oak doors at the back of the courtroom did not open. They were thrown inward. Both of them, simultaneously, with a force that drove them hard into the stone walls on either side and left them shuddering in their frames, the crack of heavy wood against ancient stone so loud and so sudden in the silent room that 3 people in the gallery stood up involuntarily, their bodies responding to the sound before their minds could interpret it. Harrison Wycliffe walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The people of Yorkshire called him the Silent Duke. They had called him that for 5 years, since the night the Wycliffe estate burned and took his father and his brother and his voice with it. 5 years of silence. 5 years of managing his empire through written orders and intermediaries and the specific authority of a man who had decided that the world did not deserve his words and had stopped giving them. He was 6 feet and 4 inches. He was built the way cliffs are built, not by any single act of force but by years of accumulated pressure, the accumulation of hard labor and harder weather and the specific physical density of a man who has been carrying a great weight for a very long time and has simply become the shape of the carrying. His greatcoat was black and heavy and swallowed the winter light around him as he walked. His face was severe, the harsh angular geometry of a man whose features had been cut rather than grown, a jaw like a closing door, pale skin weathered by 5 Yorkshire winters spent mostly outdoors, a faint white scar crossing his chin where the stone had found him on the night of the fire. His eyes were the color of a winter sky in the last hour before a blizzard breaks, that specific gray that is not absence of color but the compression of all light into something dense and absolute and entirely without softness. He walked past Lord Sterling without looking at him. He walked past the clerk's table without looking at it. He walked past the gallery and the shuffling, standing, staring spectators without giving any of them a single fraction of his attention. He stopped directly in front of the magistrate's bench. He reached into the deep pocket of his greatcoat with one large gloved hand. He drew out a ring. It was massive, heavy gold, the Wycliffe family crest pressed into the signet face, the kind of object that has been in a family long enough to absorb the specific weight of its history, old enough that the gold had developed the particular deep warmth of a thing handled by many hands across many generations. He threw it onto the bench. The sound it made when it struck the wood, that flat, ringing, entirely definitive crack of heavy gold against old oak, was the loudest thing in the room. It was louder than the doors had been. It rang in the walls and in the floorboards and in the specific silence that followed it, a silence of a completely different quality than the one that had preceded it. Malker stared at the ring. The color left his face in a single movement, the way color leaves a cloth when you wring the water from it, completely, immediately, leaving something pale and shapeless behind. "Your Grace," Malker said. His voice had lost all its official register. It was simply the voice of a frightened man. I do not understand. Harrison looked at him. The debt is paid, he said. His voice was a sound that had not been heard in this room in half a decade. It was deep and dark and rough from years of disuse, carrying the heavy texture of a thing that had been kept in a cold place too long and was only now being brought back into the air. It was not a loud voice. It did not need to be. It vibrated in the floorboards. It vibrated in the bench. It vibrated in the chest cavity of every person in the room with the specific quality of a sound that means, this is the last time I will say this. The women belong to my estate. Sterling moved. His face had gone from triumph to red fury in the time it took the ring to stop ringing against the wood. He stepped forward into the aisle. He was going to speak. He was going to invoke the law and the contract and the 20-year indenture that had been almost his and the specific outrage of a man whose arranged victory has been taken from him by someone he had not anticipated. Harrison turned his head. He looked at Sterling. The look lasted less than 2 seconds. It contained no anger, that was the thing about it that was most terrifying. Anger implied the possibility of appeal, the existence of an emotional state that could be reasoned with or mollified or redirected. What was in Harrison Wycliffe's eyes when he looked at Lord Victor Sterling was not anger. It was the cold, flat, entirely dispassionate assessment of a man who has identified a problem and is calculating its removal, and the calculation is already complete. I own the bank that holds the mortgage on your estate, Harrison said. His voice was even and quiet and utterly final. I own the ships that carry your wool. I own the road that gives you access to the county market. If you speak to me again before I leave this room, I will foreclose on your entire bloodline before the ink dries on the afternoon post. Sterling's mouth was open. He closed it. Harrison turned back to the prisoner's box. He looked at Genevieve for the first time. He did not look at her the way Sterling had looked at her, not with assessment or hunger or the particular categorizing gaze of a man measuring what a woman is worth to his purposes. He looked at her with the quiet, absolute attention of a man who has just encountered something he was not expecting and is giving it the full weight of his consideration, without agenda, without performance. Genevieve looked back at him. She was standing very still, her hands still on the wooden rail, Elara's grip still on her arm from behind. She had been prepared to sell 20 years of her life in the next 30 seconds. She had been prepared to walk into Lord Sterling's house and manage whatever came with the same calculating composure that had gotten her through everything else. She had made her calculation and committed to it entirely. She had not calculated for this. Walk, Harrison said. Genevieve took her sister's hand and walked out of the wooden box. She did not look at Malker. She did not look at Sterling. She followed the heavy black wool of Harrison Wycliffe's greatcoat through the ruined oak doors and out into the freezing Yorkshire rain, and she breathed, for the first time in 48 hours, without the specific weight of her sister's sentence on the precise center of her chest. The carriage ride to Wycliffe Manor took 3 hours through the frozen moors. The interior was lined in dark grey velvet, heated by brass bricks beneath the floorboards. Elara fell asleep against the padded wall within the first 20 minutes, wrapped in the thick wool blanket Harrison had taken from the carriage compartment and placed around her without a word, without asking whether it was wanted, simply identifying a need and addressing it with the efficiency of a man for whom care was an action rather than a performance. Genevieve did not sleep. She sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she looked across the small dark carriage at the man who had thrown down the most significant object in his family's possession to purchase 2 women from a provincial court, and she thought about what she knew and what she didn't know and what the difference between those 2 things was likely to cost her. She knew the ring. Everyone in the northern counties knew the Wycliffe signet ring, not because it was famous in the social way of fashionable things, but because it was famous in the way of old, serious, historically weighted objects. It had been on the hand of a Wycliffe duke for 6 generations. It had been the instrument of sealed agreements and territorial decisions and the kind of authority that accrues to families who have been holding power in one place long enough that their name is indistinguishable from the landscape. The previous duke had been buried with a copy. The original, the real one, had stayed with the heir. Harrison had thrown it onto a provincial magistrate's bench without hesitation. He sat across from her now with his coat on, his jaw set, his eyes on the window, and he was entirely silent. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say. The silence of someone who has made a decision about what words are worth and is enforcing that decision with the same absolute consistency that appeared to govern everything else about him. "Why did you buy us?" Genevieve said. The question came out quietly, without accusation, simply direct. She had decided on the journey from the courtroom that she was not going to manage her way through this the way she managed everything else, with calculation and patience and the careful deployment of information. She had seen what happened to women who tried to navigate from a position of concealment when the man they were navigating around already knew the terrain better than they did. Harrison did not turn immediately. He watched the snow-buried moors for a long moment, his breath a faint mist in the cold air of the carriage. "I did not buy you," he said. His voice was the same as it had been in the courtroom, rough, low, carrying the texture of long disuse, but not unkind. Never unkind. "I purchased the right to remove you from a monster." He looked at Alara sleeping in the corner. Something moved through his expression when he looked at her, a brief, carefully contained thing, here and gone. "Sterling ruins everything he touches," he said. "I do not allow him to touch things in my county." Genevieve looked at her hands. "We have no money to repay the value of that ring," she said. "The ring is a piece of metal," Harrison said. "You offered to trade your entire life for your sister's freedom." He paused, his eyes moving back to the window. "That is a currency I understand." He did not speak again. Wycliffe Manor appeared at dusk, emerging from the snow and the falling dark like something that had grown from the rock rather than been placed upon it. It sat on a high cliff above a frozen lake, ancient and severe, its dark grey stone the same color as the sky above it, its towers worn smooth by centuries of northern weather into shapes that looked more geological than architectural. It was not a beautiful house. It was a true one, the kind of structure that has been weathered into an honest account of itself. In the courtyard a line of servants stood waiting despite the wind, their faces composed and serious in the way of people who serve someone they genuinely respect rather than simply fear. Harrison stepped down from the carriage and turned and offered his hand to Genevieve. She looked at it for 1 second, large, gloved, extended with the matter-of-fact steadiness of a man who had decided she needed help down and was providing it without making it a question. She placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and entirely sure, pulling her down to the cobblestones with an effortlessness that was not a display of strength but simply what strength looked like when it was not performing. He did not release her hand immediately. He stood on the cobblestones in the falling dark and looked at her, standing straight in her thin dress in the freezing courtyard, refusing to shiver, her chin level, her eyes returning his gaze without apology, and something in his face changed in a way that was too subtle and too quick to name before it was gone. "Show them to the south wing," he said to the housekeeper. He dropped her hand and walked toward the stables without looking back. "Provide whatever they require." That night, from the window of her room in the warm south wing, Genevieve watched Harrison Wycliffe walk across the snow-covered courtyard without his coat. She watched him walk to the far edge of the property where a ruined stone foundation sat half buried in the white, the blackened remnants of a building that had burned a long time ago and not been cleared away. She watched him stand in the center of the ruins in the freezing dark, alone, the snow falling around him and on him, and she understood without being told that this was something he did regularly, and that whatever it was not grief in any ordinary sense. It was something older and more structural than grief. It was the act of a man who visits his own ruins so regularly that he has memorized their exact dimensions, and stands in them not because it helps but because the alternative, forgetting their shape, is something he will not allow. She watched him until the snow fell too thick to see. For 2 weeks the manor was warm and entirely without the Duke. Genevieve and Alara were given rooms in the south wing with fires that burned continuously and a housekeeper of exceptional competence who provided what was needed before it was requested. The estate doctor came for Alara and declared her recovered. The kitchen sent food of a quality neither of them had encountered before. The house moved around them with the quiet, well-organized efficiency of a place that had been properly run for a long time by people who knew what they were doing. Genevieve explored. She had always explored. As a child she had explored the edges of every space she was placed in, not from restlessness but from the practical conviction that a room you have not fully mapped is a room you cannot properly navigate. She explored the Wycliffe Manor's corridors and its public rooms and its outbuildings, learning the architecture of the place the way she had learned the architecture of every place she had ever needed to survive. She found the library on the ground floor on the fourth day. It was enormous, a massive room that ran the full depth of the house, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of volumes, its air thick with the smell of cedar and old paper and the specific quality of a room that has been used seriously for its intended purpose for a very long time. There were reading chairs near the tall windows, heavy and worn to the specific shape of a person who has spent a great deal of time in them. There was a large desk in the center with a crystal water pitcher and several stacks of correspondence. There were maps on the walls and charts on the side tables and, on the lower shelves near the fireplace, rows of legal volumes organized by county and year. Genevieve sat in the reading chair nearest the fire and began with the histories. She read the account of the fire that had taken the previous duke and his heir 6 years prior. She read the inquest report, the official account, brief and procedural and notable for everything it did not explain. She read the provision in the county fire order that had prevented the village wagons from responding, signed by Magistrate Malker on the grounds of a jurisdictional error that existed in no previous record of county law. She read it twice. She sat with it in the warm quiet of the library and thought about the ring on the bench and the magistrate's face losing its color and the specific quality of Harrison Wycliffe's voice when he spoke a sentence for the first time in 5 years, and she thought, he has been waiting. He had been waiting, quietly and methodically, in the specific way of a man who understands that destruction requires preparation and preparation requires patience, and he has had 5 years to prepare. She was still reading when the heavy oak door opened on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks into her stay. Harrison walked in. He was in a dark riding coat, his boots wet with fresh snow, his hair disordered by the wind. He stopped when he saw her sitting in his reading chair with his property law volume spread across the side table. His face registered her presence without expressing a clear response to it, a face that had learned not to announce itself. Genevieve started to rise, already calculating whether to apologize or simply leave. "Stay," he said. He crossed to the desk. He poured water from the crystal pitcher and drank it, looking at her over the rim of the glass with the direct, unhurried attention he had given her in the courtroom. It was not a social look. It was not the look of a man finding a woman attractive in the way that men announce their finding, loudly, as though attraction is an achievement. It was simply the look of someone paying full attention, which was in its own way the most intimate thing anyone had offered her in years. "You read the law," he said. "I prefer to know the rules of the game I am forced to play," Genevieve said. She closed the volume. "Lord Stirling used the law as a weapon against my sister. Magistrate Malker used it as a transaction. I will not be ignorant of their weapons again." Harrison set the glass down. The crystal against the polished wood rang in the quiet room. He walked to her chair. He was very large in the fire-lit library, large the way rooms feel large when a storm is pressing against the windows, large with a quality of contained pressure that was not threatening but was impossible to ignore. He stopped in front of her and placed his hands on the arms of the chair, lowering his face to her level, and the gray of his eyes in the firelight was the most awake thing she had ever seen in a person's face. "The law is a fiction written by men who own the pens," he said. "Do not study their weapons, Genevieve. Study their weaknesses." The fire crackled. The snow pressed against the tall windows. He was close enough that she could see the faint white line of the scar across his chin and smell the pine and cold wind of the outdoors still on his coat and feel the warmth radiating from the sheer physical mass of him in the narrow space between his arms and the chair back. She did not lean away. "What is Lord Stirling's weakness?" she said. Harrison was quiet for a moment. That was not hesitation but consideration, a man who does not say things until he has decided to say them, giving a question its full due. "His pride," Harrison said. "And tomorrow I am going to break it." He straightened and walked back to his desk and opened his correspondence without another word. But he did not ask her to leave. He worked and she read, and the fire burned between them, and the silence in the room was entirely different from the silence of the courtroom, warmer, and more considered, and carrying the specific quality of a silence that two people have arrived at together rather than been assigned. She looked up once and found him watching her. He looked back at his correspondence without acknowledgement. She looked back at her book. Outside, the snow fell thick and silent over the frozen lake. If you have been watching this long, then you already understand something about what this story is. It is not about a rescue. Genevieve Thorne was not rescued in that courtroom. A woman who calculates the weight of a brass inkwell while standing in a prisoner's box and offers her entire life for her sister's freedom does not need to be rescued. She needs to be seen. And Harrison Wycliffe, sitting in a library working through his correspondence while a woman reads his law books in his chair and does not apologize for being there, he is beginning to understand the difference between those two things. Subscribe right now to be part of this community. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below telling us your city and country, we read every single one. And tell us, what was the moment in that courtroom that made you stop breathing? We are going back. Because the morning is coming, and the Duke promised to break a man's pride before noon. The morning was brilliantly cold. The snow that had fallen for 3 days had stopped before dawn, leaving the world outside Wycliffe Manor under a layer of white so clean and absolute that it seemed less like weather and more like a statement. The sky above it was the pale sharp blue of a winter morning that has decided to be entirely clear, the kind of sky that offers no cover and no obscurity and no comfortable ambiguity about what is happening in it. Genevieve was at the library window when she heard the horses. She had been there since 6 o'clock, reading by the first pale light of the morning, not because she could not sleep but because the library had become the place she thought best, and she had a great deal to think about. She heard the sound of hooves on the approach road and then the sound of voices in the courtyard, and she recognized one of them before she moved to look. Lord Victor Sterling sat on a massive grey gelding in the centre of the Wycliffe courtyard. He was flanked by 4 of his estate guards, heavy men in riding coats with weapons at their belts, and beside him on a roan horse sat Magistrate Malker, thinner than he had looked in the courtroom and more frightened looking, his official coat sitting on him like a costume he had put on hoping it would provide more protection than it appeared to be providing. Sterling's face was red with cold and with the specific quality of outrage that belongs to men who have convinced themselves that all obstacles are temporary. He sat on his horse with the aggressive authority of someone who has prepared a legal argument and has brought armed men to underline it, and he looked up at the manor's closed front doors with the expression of a man who expects them to open immediately. "Bring out the Duke," Sterling called. His voice carried across the courtyard and up to where Genevieve stood at the library window, clean and clear in the cold air. She was already moving away from the window and toward the door before she had consciously decided to do so. She came out onto the front steps as the heavy manor doors swung open. She stood in the doorway as Harrison walked past her and down the stone steps into the courtyard. He was not wearing a coat. This was the detail that Genevieve registered first and that the men on horseback registered a half-second later, and the registration was visible in the slight collective rearrangement of the horses, the almost unconscious physical response of animals who are better at reading danger than the men riding them. He wore dark trousers and a white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the temperature, exposing forearms that were thick with muscle and crossed with the old pale scars of a man who had done years of physical work and not shied from the conditions. He walked down the steps and stood in the snow in front of the horses and said nothing. He did not look at Sterling. He looked at the ground in front of him with the calm, complete stillness of a man who is not anxious, is not performing calm, is simply waiting with the absolute patience of something that has already decided what is going to happen and is giving the other party the opportunity to choose how they want to arrive at it. "Wycliffe," Sterling said. "The provincial court has reviewed the transfer. The transaction was highly irregular. The labor contract the older one signed. The contract is void," Harrison said, without looking up. "The law requires," Malker began. Harrison raised his eyes to the magistrate's face. Malker stopped speaking. "There is a protocol for the women," Sterling said. The court order gives them to my estate. You cannot simply throw a ring at the law, Wycliffe, no matter how much gold it's made of. I am here to collect what belongs to me by legal order. Harrison looked at Sterling then. He looked at him for a full silent moment, the kind of look that has a physical quality, a weight and a temperature, something that the men on horseback felt in their hands on the reins. He reached into his pocket. Every hand near a weapon tightened. Every horse shifted. He pulled out a thick stack of folded parchment bound in black ribbon and held it for a moment and then threw it into the snow at the feet of Sterling's horse. The gelding startled, pulling back, stamping. Sterling fought the reins. The parchment lay in the white snow, the black ribbon dark against it. What is that? Sterling said. His voice had changed register. That, Harrison said, is the complete financial history of your estate. He took one step forward, his boots silent in the snow. I have been collecting it for 3 years. He took another step. I own the note on your east farmland, purchased from your creditors in July. I own the mortgage on Ashby Hall, the bank transferred it to me in September, at my request. I own the shipping contracts through which your wool reaches the London markets. I own the road. He stopped. He was standing 5 feet from Sterling's horse and the horse was trying to back away. I own the bank. Sterling's face had undergone several rapid changes while Harrison spoke. It had moved from red outrage to a paler, concentrated attention, and then to something that was not quite white but was on its way there, each new sentence arriving like a blow to a structure that was only now revealing how much of its support had already been quietly removed. As of this morning, Harrison said, you are insolvent. The estate is mine. The horses are mine. He looked at the gelding Sterling was sitting on. That animal is mine. And the coat you are wearing was purchased on a credit account I now hold. He looked up at Sterling's face. You came here to collect property. You own nothing, Sterling. You came here to collect something from a man you owe everything to. Sterling opened his mouth. If you say anything other than goodbye, Harrison said, I will add your remaining personal assets to the seizure order before you clear the gate. The silence in the courtyard was total. The horses breathed. The snow was very white and very still around the black ribbon of the fallen parchment. Sterling turned his horse. The turn was not graceful. He hauled the animal's head around with the crude urgency of a man who needs to be somewhere that is not here and does not care how he looks getting there. The gelding's hooves scattered snow across the cobblestones as he drove it toward the gate. His guards followed without a word, without a glance back, with the rapidly recalibrating loyalty of men who understand that their employer is no longer an employer. Malker remained. His horse stood trembling slightly, the animal reading something from its rider that was communicated through the reins. Harrison turned to look at him. Malker was not a large man on his horse. He was, in the hard winter light with Sterling's retreating back disappearing through the iron gates, a very small and very frightened man on a horse that wanted to leave. Your Grace, Malker said. His voice was the voice of a man attempting to find the specific form of words that will make a thing not be what it is. I was applying the law as written. I had no authority to. I am sending an auditor to the provincial court this afternoon, Harrison said. He said it the way you say the weather, a fact, a condition, entirely without anger. They will be reviewing the fire order you signed 6 years ago. The jurisdictional provision you cited does not exist in any record of county law before or since. He paused. You will be in a prison cell before the week is out. He looked at the man on the trembling horse for one more second. Ride. Malker rode. The courtyard was empty and silent. The snow was undisturbed except for the pockmarks of hooves and the fallen parchment with its black ribbon lying in the white. Harrison stood in the center of it in his shirt sleeves with the cold air moving around him and his chest rising and falling with the slow, deliberate breathing of a man who has been carrying something at high tension for a very long time and is carefully, methodically releasing it. Genevieve came down the steps. She walked through the snow to where he stood and stopped in front of him and looked at his hands. There was a small cut on his right knuckle where the cold had cracked the skin, a dark line of dried blood against the pale. "You are freezing," she said. Harrison looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the library, the full, unhurried, entirely committed attention of a man who has no other purpose in this moment than to see the person standing in front of him clearly. "I am fine," he said. "You are bleeding," she said. She reached out and took his hand, both of hers around his one, her warm fingers closing around the cold of his, and she held it and looked at the cut and did not let go. Harrison closed his eyes. He stood in the snow in the freezing courtyard with a woman holding his damaged hand, and he breathed out, slowly, completely, the long slow exhale of a man who has been holding himself in a state of controlled readiness for 5 years and has just, in this moment, allowed himself to put it down. "Come inside," Genevieve said. She led him back up the steps, his hand in both of hers, and he followed without a word. The library fire had burned to deep red embers by the time the last of the evening light left the frozen lake. The house was quiet around them. Elara had gone to bed 2 hours ago, tired in the specific way of a person who has been afraid for a very long time and has finally been given a safe place to stop. The servants had retreated. The wind that had been pressing against the manor's north face all day had settled into something quieter, a low and steady sound that was almost companionable. Genevieve sat in the leather chair by the embers. She had changed out of her wool dress into a simpler one, dark gray, and her hair was down from its pins, and she looked at the red glow in the hearth and thought about Lord Stirling riding through the gate and Malker's hands on the reins and the black ribbon lying in the snow and the specific quality of a man's face when 5 years of preparation finally arrives at its conclusion. She thought about the ruins at the edge of the property where Harrison stood alone in the storms. Harrison sat on the edge of the mahogany desk watching her. He had changed his shirt but not added a coat, and his sleeves were still rolled, and in the ember light the old scars on his forearms were visible as faint topographic variations in the pale skin, a map of physical history. He looked exhausted in the way of someone who has expended a great and sustained effort and has come to the end of it, the specific tiredness that comes not from weakness but from the completion of a thing that has required everything. The room was quiet between them. It was a good quiet, the kind that has been earned, that two people have arrived at together rather than fallen into separately. It was the quiet of the library, which they had been building for 3 weeks without naming what they were building. "You have been waiting for him," Genevieve said. Not as an accusation. As an observation. Harrison looked at the embers. 5 years, he said. His voice was the same low, rough, dark instrument it always was, but there was something in it now that had not been there before: the courtyard, a looseness, a slight releasing of the controlled quality that was usually present in every word. The night of the fire. The order Malker signed. Stirling owned the lumber company that was supposed to supply the fire wagons. He was owed money by the previous court. The connection took me 3 years to document completely. He was quiet for a moment. "I could not go after him with anger," he said. "Anger is a weapon that destroys the hand that holds it. I had to be patient enough that when I moved, everything moved at once." He paused. Today was the day everything moved at once. Genevieve looked at him. She thought about the ring on the bench and said the thing she had been thinking about since the courtroom. "You threw down the ring for us," she said. "But you also threw it down for them. You have been waiting to use it against Malker for 5 years." Harrison was silent for a long moment. "Yes," he said. And the moment presented itself in a courtroom where 2 women were about to pay for something they did not do. He looked at her directly. The 2 things were not in conflict. She looked back at him. She thought about the calculation in the prisoner's box, the inkwell, the distance to the door, the 20 years of her life she had been prepared to spend. She thought about the specific fact that she had made that calculation entirely alone, with Elara's weight against her shoulder and no reasonable expectation of anything other than the arithmetic working out the way it was going to work out. "Why did you speak?" she said. He looked at her. "In the courtroom," she said. You had not spoken in 5 years. You could have written a note to the magistrate. You could have sent a representative. Why did you speak? The embers shifted. A small collapse of red into deeper red, a brief increase in warmth. Harrison got up from the desk. He crossed the room to her chair and knelt down in front of it, the way he had been large in every other context and is somehow entirely precise in this one, not looming, not overwhelming, simply present, at her level, his gray eyes in the ember light the most awake and the most honest thing she has seen in any room she has been in. Because you asked him to take your life instead, Harrison said. His voice was very low. And I needed the room to understand that I was saying no. Genevieve looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the harsh geometry of his face and the scar on his chin and the faint lines around his eyes that were the lines of a man who has spent 5 years outdoors in Yorkshire winters and indoors with the specific weight of unresolved grief, and she looked at the ember light on all of it and she thought, this is what a person looks like when they have been honest for the first time in 5 years. This is what 5 years of silence sounds like when it finally breaks for the right reason. She reached down and placed her hands over his where they rested on the arms of the chair. She felt the calluses and the strength and the slight tremor in his fingers that was the only evidence of anything he was not fully managing. You are the most terrifying man I have ever been in a room with, she said. Harrison looked at her hands on his. A small breath left him, the very edge of something that was not quite a laugh but shared its origins. I have not been in many rooms lately, he said. She felt the corner of her mouth move despite herself. I noticed. She looked at him. You stood in the snow without a coat for 20 minutes this morning while a man tried to take something from you. I was not cold, he said. You were bleeding. He was quiet. I did not notice, he said. She kept her hands over his. She thought about what it meant to not notice cold, not notice blood, the specific quality of self-neglect that belongs to people who have been alone in their grief for long enough that the maintenance of their own physical experience has stopped seeming important. She thought about the ruins in the snow. Tell me about the fire, she said. It was not a request she had planned. It came from the same place the question about speaking had come from, the direct, honest place that she went to when she was done managing and simply needed to know something. Harrison was still for a long time. The embers moved. The wind pressed against the north wall. My father was in the east study, he said finally. My brother was on the upper landing. The fire started in the west wing, in the rooms belonging to the lumber company's representative who had been staying as a guest. He paused. I carried my father as far as the courtyard. I went back for my brother. He was already gone. He paused again. I stood in the ruins for a long time afterward. I found that when I tried to speak, there was nothing there. As though the words had been in the house and the house had burned. He looked at the embers. The first time I spoke after that, he said, was in that courtroom. Genevieve looked at him. The specific weight of that, 5 years of choosing silence, and the first words going to a provincial magistrate on behalf of 2 women he did not know because a woman in a prisoner's box had offered to trade her entire life. Then those words were not wasted, she said. Something moved through his face that was too complex to name and entirely visible in the ember light. He leaned forward. He moved slowly, with the specific unhurried deliberateness of a man who believes in giving people the full opportunity to choose, who has not arrived at this moment in order to take something but to offer something and to wait for the answer. She did not pull back. She lifted her hands from his and placed them on his shoulders, gripping the fabric of his shirt, the muscle beneath it, the warmth and the solidity of a person who has been standing in frozen courtyards and snow-covered ruins for 5 years and is, right now, entirely present. He kissed her with the fierce, devoted certainty of a man who has not allowed himself to want something for a very long time and has finally stopped refusing it. Not gentle, complete. The way the ring on the bench had been complete. The way his voice in the courtroom had been complete. No ambiguity, no performance, no middle ground between what it was and what it meant. She kissed him back with equal force, her hands in his dark hair, his arms around her waist lifting her from the chair, and the fire behind them was only embers and the room was dark except for the red glow and the snow outside had stopped entirely, the storm finally over, the lake outside the window perfectly still under its white surface. They stayed in the ember light for a long time. When he finally held her simply, her head against his chest, his chin at her temple, both of them breathing in the quiet dark, she could feel the steady rhythm of his heart and the absence of the tension that had been in him since the courtroom, the absence of 5 years of cold and contained and carefully managed. "I need to know something," she said into the warmth of his shirt. He waited. "The ring," she said. "The signet ring you threw down on the bench." His family ring, 6 generations old, thrown onto a provincial magistrate's desk without hesitation or discussion or a single moment of calculation. "What will you do about it?" she said. Harrison was quiet for a moment. "The ring is on the bench," he said. "Where it belongs." She lifted her head and looked at him. He looked back at her in the very last of the ember light with the expression of a man stating a simple fact about priorities. "I will have another made," he said. He paused. "For the purpose it was always meant for." She looked at him for a long time. Then she put her head back against his chest and listened to the quiet and the cooling of the fire and the sound of a house that had been silent for 5 years beginning, very slowly, to find its way back to the sound of people living in it. Elara grew up in Wycliffe Manor. She grew up running through its corridors and filling its rooms with noise and turning the silent fortress back into the living, breathing, heated place it had been built to be. She grew up watching the Duke of Wycliffe, the most terrifying man in the northern counties, the man they had called silent for 5 years, laugh at her sister's jokes at the breakfast table and argue with her sister over property law in the library and carry her sister across the snow when her boots were the wrong ones for the conditions. Lord Stirling died in a debtor's cell in the county prison, insolvent and unmourned, the estate that had been in his family for 200 years absorbed into the Wycliffe holdings and reorganized by a duchess who had once calculated the weight of a brass inkwell in a provincial courtroom. Magistrate Malker broke rocks in the northern penal colony for 19 years. The irony of his situation was noted by no one who cared. And the silent Duke was not silent anymore. He was not loud. He still chose his words with the precision of a man who has learned their value. But he gave them freely, in the library and the courtyard and the warm south wing rooms and the long walks along the cliff above the frozen lake. He gave them only to people who deserved them. He gave most of them to his wife, who had once stood in a prisoner's box and offered everything she had and found, on the other side of that offering, that a man she had not accounted for had been listening, and that what he heard in her voice was not desperation, but a woman who understood exactly what things were worth, and was not afraid to pay the price. The ring was remade. The crest the same. The gold the same deep warm weight of a thing that has been in a family long enough to mean something. He placed it on his hand on the morning of their wedding and she looked at it on his finger and thought, 6 generations and a provincial magistrate's bench in a courtroom in the frozen north and 2 women in a prisoner's box and a man who had not spoken in 5 years finding his voice for this specific purpose. She thought it was very good accounting. If this story found you somewhere real, if Genevieve in that prisoner's box spoke something you recognized, then you already know why this channel exists. Every story at Regent Hearts is about a woman who made the most expensive offer in the room with nothing but herself to back it. Every story is about what happens when someone is finally seen clearly enough to be worth the ring being thrown down for. Subscribe right now. Hit the notification bell so you are there for the next story the moment it goes live. Leave a comment with your city and your country, we read every one, and we want to know where in the world this found you. Share this with someone who needs to hear that offering everything you have and having someone say no, not as a refusal, but as a better answer, is not a story that ends in a courtroom. It is a story that ends by a fire. With the silence broken. And the ring made new. We will see you in the next one.